Wait, he's performing Scarbo? The judge scoffed, eyebrows raised as the boy with noise-canceling headphones approached the piano. 16-year-old Eli had been mocked, dismissed, and nearly laughed off the stage. An autistic teen with no formal tutor and a piece considered the hardest ever written, he had every reason to quit. But when he sat at that piano, something happened. He didn't just play Scarbo, he became it. And by the time the last note fell into silence, the room would never be the same. This is the true power of expression beyond expectation. A story of defiance, music, memory, and a boy who didn't want the spotlight, only to be understood. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. You don't really think he's competing, do you? The voice was sharp, a girl's voice, nasal, practiced, dismissive, cutting through the thick hush of the auditorium lobby like a knife across silk. Around her, a small cluster of teenagers in tuxedos and floor-length recital gowns turned in unison, their gazes sharpening with interest as they tracked the direction of her smirk. There he was, Eli Rivers, standing alone by the competition sign-in table, with his shoulders drawn tightly together like he was trying to fold into himself and disappear. The sleeves of his black suit jacket were slightly too short, exposing pale wrists lined with faint red marks, habits of anxious tugging. His headphones, large and gray with worn padding, cupped his ears like armor. In his hands, crumpled gently between careful fingers, was a folded piece of sheet music. One corner of it was frayed from being touched too many times. The girl's laughter rose again. Did someone sign him up as a prank? Eli flinched. Not visibly, not enough for the others to notice, but something behind his eyes faltered. His mother, standing just behind him with a registration folder pressed tightly to her chest, stepped forward. "Excuse me, where's the line to submit forms?" The receptionist looked up. Young, probably a volunteer, wearing an ill-fitting staff blazer with a crooked name badge. Her eyes flicked from Eli's face to the noise-canceling headphones. A pause. That small, heavy pause that always came before the question. Is he performing? The mother gave a polite but firm nod. Yes, Eli is registered for the solo performance category. Oh, the receptionist blinked and tried to smile. It came out strained. Okay, I'll just, let me check. Behind them, whispers swelled. One boy leaned against a pillar, watching with open amusement. Did you see what piece he picked? I saw it on the list. Scarbo, Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit. He laughed, low and mean. Even I wouldn't touch that demon of a piece, another added. Maybe he'll surprise us, like play it with his feet or something. The jokes stung even when they weren't direct. Eli didn't meet their eyes. He didn't turn around. He simply stared at the marble floor tile beneath his shoes, rocking ever so slightly on the balls of his feet. The quiet, rhythmic motion, back and forth, grounded him in a space that wasn't entirely here. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when music was the only place that made sense, where notes didn't lie, where tempo never changed to confuse or betray you, where silence was a language, not a punishment. The registration clipboard was passed to his mother. She filled out the rest of the form and placed it gently on the stack without a word. Eli gave a quick flicker of a glance to the laminated badge she handed him, Contestant 117, and then tucked it carefully into his pocket. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Eli gave a tiny nod. Then, just as his hand brushed the edge of the registration table, he hesitated. His fingers stopped over the final page. The performance list. His name was at the very bottom. 117, Eli Rivers, Maurice Ravel, Scarbo. He didn't need to see the other names. He didn't need to read the other titles. He'd already done it a dozen times. The average selection, Beethoven sonatas, Chopin nocturnes, maybe one daring soul attempting Liszt's La Campanella. But none dared Scarbo. No one expected someone like him to. The piece was madness, a musical nightmare filled with whirling, sharp-edged rhythms that crashed and scattered across the keys like shattered glass. Ravel himself admitted it was one of the hardest piano pieces ever conceived. Scarbo, the malicious goblin of the night, haunted pianists across generations, and Eli had chosen it, more accurately, his grandmother had. He could still remember that moment, like it was burned into the inside of his mind. She'd sat him down after his 12th birthday, pulling out a recording and playing it without saying a word. He'd flinched at the first phrase, a storm of notes that darted in and out like ghosts, but she had only smiled, gently placing her hand over his. "This is the one," she said. "When you're ready, Eli, you'll play Scarbo. And when you do, you won't just play music, you'll tell your story." Back then, he didn't understand. Not fully. But now, at 16, with her gone for nearly 2 years, her words echoed like chords in a cathedral. This was for her. They moved through the building, a towering conservatory with ceilings that arched like Gothic cathedrals and walls lined with portraits of stoic, stern-faced composers. The hallways were filled with echoes of practice runs and the low hum of nervous breathing. Every other competitor seemed to have an entourage: tutors, accompanists, friends in matching blazers, doting parents offering sips of water and last-minute advice. Eli had only his mother. And a scarf. A deep maroon shawl, frayed at the edges, that once belonged to his grandmother. He kept it folded in his pocket, pressed flat like an amulet. When his anxiety climbed too high, he touched it and counted the loose threads one by one. Sometimes he'd hold it in both hands and feel like she was still near, watching from the wings. He passed the warm-up room. A dozen pianos occupied tight corners. The air pulsed with scales and crashing chords as contestants rehearsed at full volume, each trying to sound louder, faster, more precise than the next. He didn't enter. Noise like that, erratic, chaotic, shattered his focus. He knew his limits. He needed quiet. He needed space. And yet, when one competitor caught his eye and mimed a cartoonish piano meltdown, flailing arms and a goofy face, the group burst into laughter that echoed down the corridor. "Maybe we should let him play Scarbo," one girl snickered. "Might be the most fun we have all night." But Eli didn't react. He kept walking. Past them. Past the ridicule. Past the shadows that wanted him to stay small. He found a quiet hallway with a wide stained glass window and settled on a bench. From his backpack, he pulled out a tiny rubber ball and began to squeeze it rhythmically in one hand while tracing the pattern of the carpet with his shoe. His breathing slowed. The pressure inside him, that invisible pressure that built whenever he was watched, measured, judged, began to drop. In the silence, a memory surfaced. He was 5. Sitting at his grandmother's upright piano. The sun spilled through the windows in stripes, and dust motes danced in the air. She sat beside him, humming softly. "Music is a map, Eli," she said. "And you are the traveler. Let the notes show you the way." He opened his eyes. The hallway light had shifted. The sun outside was setting now, painting long amber shadows across the floor. His performance time was getting closer. He stood. As he approached the stage door, a man in a security uniform leaned lazily against the wall nearby, arms crossed. Something about him felt different, not unkind, just observant. The guard glanced up as Eli passed and murmured, almost to himself, "Hope they're ready for this one." Eli paused mid-step. Did he mean that? Before he could think further, the stage assistant beckoned him forward. "Contestant 117, you're next. You'll go on after the current performer finishes. Be ready in 60 seconds. His mother gave his hand a soft squeeze. "I'll be in the front row. Just breathe." He nodded, one step, then another. The curtain loomed before him like a velvet ocean, rich and heavy with expectation. Beyond it, the crowd, the judges, the critics, and beyond them, the ghost of Scarbo, waiting. He reached into his pocket and brushed the edge of the scarf. His fingers trembled, but he didn't turn back, because when he closed his eyes, he could already hear the first note calling, and he intended to answer. The stage was hushed. Not silent, exactly. There was still the soft cough of someone clearing their throat, the rustle of a program being folded, a chair creaking as someone shifted in their seat. But compared to the chatter of the lobby or the chaos of the warm-up room, the performance hall was cathedral quiet, sacred in its stillness. Backstage, Eli stood in the wings. The curtains towered beside him, thick and navy, slightly dusted near the bottom where years of brushing feet had worn away the velvet's luster. The dim light behind the curtain cast long shadows across the floor, making his figure look taller, more ghostly than he felt. He was trying to breathe evenly. He'd practiced this. Inhale through the nose, 4 counts, hold for 4. Exhale through the mouth, 6. Repeat. Again. Again. But the air backstage felt different now, thinner, sharper. like he was breathing through needles. Out on stage, the pianist before him finished their last passage, a romantic Chopin waltz, delicately delivered and followed by polite applause. Eli watched from the corner of his eye as the performer bowed and smiled, then exited smoothly off stage. Her eyes met his for a split second. She offered no sneer, no mockery, just a look of sympathy, or maybe pity. It didn't matter. The stagehand gave him a quiet nod. "You're up?" He stepped forward. Every footfall across the stage felt louder than it should, like thunderclaps echoing through the vast chamber. His polished shoes tapped softly against the wooden floor. Rows of faces blurred in his peripheral vision. Rows and rows of people. All watching. All waiting. At the edge of the grand piano, he paused. The instrument stood like a black beast at rest, gleaming under the stage lights, keys grinning in a perfect white arc. It was bigger than the upright he practiced on. Its sound could fill this entire space, swallow it whole. He reached into his pocket and pressed the edge of the scarf, hidden just beneath his waistband. His hand trembled, but his fingers knew what to do. He sat. His headphones were still on, not plugged into anything. They were long dead, but the padding dulled the world just enough to let him stay inside himself. He adjusted the bench, lowered his hands to the keys. They hovered there, motionless, like dragonflies suspended in air, and then stillness. For 3 seconds, 4. Somewhere in the audience, someone whispered, "He's frozen." But he wasn't frozen. He was listening. Not to the audience, not to the buzzing of lights or the shallow breaths from the first row. He was listening inward, to the peace that had lived inside him for months, for years. Scarbo, the goblin in the shadows. The phantom that danced on rooftops at midnight and vanished before dawn. He had studied every bar, memorized every note, not just with his fingers, but with his bones. He didn't just know Scarbo. He was Scarbo now. The first note struck like a blade. A shriek from the top octave, sharp and sudden, exploding into cascading triplets that tumbled down the keys like a waterfall in freefall. His fingers moved without hesitation. The left hand surged with low, growling tremolos, while the right scattered notes like sparks in the wind. The audience jerked to attention. People who had glanced at their phones moments earlier were now wide-eyed. Judges leaned forward, their pens suddenly forgotten. The piece was chaos and control, a whirling storm contained within precise boundaries. Every note was a flicker of something dark, elusive, taunting. Eli didn't look up. He didn't need to. His eyes were locked on the keys, but his mind wasn't there. It was somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. The world had disappeared, melted away, leaving only this moment. This fight between him and the demon Ravel had written into life. His fingers blurred. The rapid-fire repeated notes slammed down like hammers, relentless and exact. He reached the middle section, the infamous stretch where the rhythm fractures and the harmony twists into dissonant knots. It was here that most faltered. It was here that Scarbo laughed. Eli felt the pressure mount in his wrists, a burn creeping from tendon to elbow. He shifted posture without breaking tempo, anchoring his body, letting the momentum guide him like a wave. He saw flickers, memories flashing like lightning behind his eyes. His grandmother's voice, "If it feels like the notes are running from you, chase them faster." The boy backstage mocking his headphones. The judge at registration who'd whispered, "He won't last 5 minutes." A surge of fury swept through him, not loud or wild, but cold and focused. He wasn't here to prove them wrong. He was here to prove her right. The tension built. The rhythm became impossibly unstable, fast, sharp, off-kilter. His right hand skipped octaves in a devil's game of hide-and-seek, while the left hammered a relentless ostinato like a heartbeat in panic. The audience stopped breathing, and then, suddenly, silence. For one impossible half-second, the entire hall fell into a black void. Eli's hands hovered above the keys, suspended in midair. His chest rose and fell. A rest, a planned rest. But that single beat of silence felt like an eternity. And when he struck the next note, a low, booming G, it crashed through the room like thunder. He drove into the final section with a force no one expected. The coda of Scarbo was madness incarnate, raw velocity, jagged harmony, ghost-like trills flying between hands that barely seemed attached to a human body anymore. His expression never changed, but his soul was in the storm. Even the other competitors backstage could feel it. The girl who had mocked him earlier now stood rigid behind the curtain, mouth slightly open, her own sheet music dangling from one hand. Forgotten. A young boy in the front row whispered to his father, is he making it up? But the father, once a pianist himself, shook his head, eyes wide. No, he said softly. He's translating. At last, the final phrase, a shimmering run up the keyboard, fingers crossing in a blur, and the final note struck with a sharp, definitive crack. Then silence. Real silence. Eli sat there, hands still on the keys, chest heaving once, just once, before he dropped his hands to his lap. His head remained bowed. He didn't look up, no one moved. Then, as if breaking free from a spell, someone stood. Then another. Then 20. The applause crashed like a tidal wave. Some clapped in disbelief, some in awe. One of the judges rose slowly to his feet, his hands trembling as he joined the ovation. Eli didn't react. Not yet. The lights were too bright, the sound too loud. The scarf in his pocket was warm now, as if it held its own pulse. He pressed a hand to his chest, grounding himself. Inside the roar, he was back in that quiet living room, beside a woman who had once said, "Music doesn't ask you to explain, it asks you to feel." And finally, slowly, he stood. He gave a bow, slight but real, and turned to leave the stage as the thunder carried behind him. But just as he reached the curtain, a low voice cut through the crowd. "Who is that boy?" Eli paused. He didn't answer. He didn't have to, because Scarbo, wild, terrifying, misunderstood, had already told them. The door shut behind him with a soft thud that felt heavier than wood should. It was the kind of sound that lingered in the bones, final, echoing, faintly holy. Eli stood in the narrow backstage hallway, just a few feet from where the curtains still quivered from his exit. He didn't look back. His hands were trembling, not from fear, not even from exhaustion. They trembled the way a struck bell does, not in weakness, but from resonance, from impact. He leaned slightly against the cold backstage wall, staring at the floorboards. The red exit sign above him buzzed faintly, casting its soft glow onto the slick surface of the grand piano's lid, which now sat like a sleeping giant behind the curtain. Footsteps approached, quick, breathless ones. His mother rounded the corner and slowed only when she saw him. She didn't speak at first, just walked up quietly and cupped both of his shaking hands in hers. Her touch was warm, grounding. He didn't look up, but he did whisper, so softly that it felt like a vibration more than a sound. "Did I make her proud?" His mother's throat clenched. She gave one squeeze, knelt until her eyes were level with his, and whispered back. She heard every note. Somewhere behind them, the applause was still fading, like the slow retreat of thunder across distant hills. It had lasted a full minute longer than the previous performers. No one had expected that. Especially not the judges. Inside the adjudication room, murmurs rippled like wind across tall grass. One of the judges, a silver-haired woman with piercing blue eyes and a lifetime of experience teaching at Juilliard, stared at her notes with the kind of bewildered reverence usually reserved for miracles. "That piece was not just played, it was inhabited," she said slowly, pen poised above the scoring sheet but unmoving. Every phrase had intent, but the boy didn't even look at the audience once. Another judge, younger, with skepticism still clinging to the corners of his mouth, crossed his arms. "There's no way that was clean. It was too fast. He rushed it." "Run the footage," the woman said calmly. "Now." And so they did. Backstage, Eli sat on a folding chair near the emergency exit, sipping from a small bottle of water. His headphones were back over his ears, not playing anything, just offering that familiar soft pressure that allowed the rest of the world to blur. But inside his head, everything was still too loud. Not in volume, but in feeling. The memory of the notes, the rhythm that had pulsed like blood. The final echo of the last chord. It wasn't over for him. It would never really be over. He had given it everything, and yet he felt hollow. Not in a sad way, not even in a way he could name. Just emptied, like someone who had screamed underwater and surfaced gasping for something more than air. He didn't know what to do with the stillness that followed. That was when a shadow passed in front of him. He glanced up. It was her. The girl from earlier, the one who had laughed in the lobby, mocked him in whispers, and played her own piece with the effortless polish of a child prodigy. But now, her expression was different. She didn't smirk. She didn't scoff. She looked small. Her posture was rigid, arms crossed like she wasn't sure why she'd come. But she cleared her throat and said, I just wanted to say, that was insane. Like, really. He blinked slowly, uncertain whether it was a compliment or another trap. She shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know you could play like that. I mean, that piece, no one even touches Scarbo. Even my teacher tells me to stay away from it. Eli said nothing. She waited for a reply that didn't come, then bit her lip. Anyway, good job. Then she turned and walked off, her footsteps sounding much smaller than her voice had been earlier that day. He didn't chase the moment. He didn't need to. It had already happened. The shift had begun. In the judge's chamber, the replay ended. The silence that followed was charged, no longer with doubt, but with disbelief. The young judge leaned forward, slowly rewinding one portion, watching Eli's hands as they executed a particularly impossible cross-hand leap. His brow furrowed, then raised. It was clean, he admitted. Insanely fast, but clean. Of course it was, said the woman beside him. You heard him, didn't you? He wasn't playing for points. He was telling a story none of us could hear until it was inside us. The head judge, an elderly man who had remained quiet until now, spoke finally. That boy, he didn't win this competition, he transcended it. Outside the judge's chamber, in the main hall, the competition continued. More performers stepping up, more polished renditions of beloved classics, more bows and careful smiles. But a quiet current had shifted through the audience. Parents whispered to each other. Teachers exchanged glances. And everyone, without quite saying it aloud, compared each performance not to the last, but to the boy in black with the trembling hands who hadn't said a word. Somewhere in the front lobby, a regional reporter from the local arts journal began scribbling a new headline on her notepad. Silent genius brings down the house. Teen Scarbo stuns judges. But Eli didn't know any of that. He sat quietly beside his mother, the scarf still clutched in his pocket, watching a speck of dust dance in a slant of light coming through the hallway window. The adrenaline had worn off, and now the quietness inside him was slowly being filled with something else. Not pride, not even relief. Something softer, something sacred. The feeling of being heard. He had never spoken in crowds. He struggled to look people in the eye. Teachers called him brilliant but challenging. Peers called him weird. Outsiders didn't know what to call him at all. But here, in a room full of strangers, with nothing but black and white keys and the legacy of a composer who also lived on the fringes, he had made them listen. And they did. Not because he demanded it, but because the music had. Later that evening, as the lights dimmed and the last performers filed out, the head judge approached Eli and his mother in the hallway. He held a clipboard in one hand and an envelope in the other. His expression was unreadable at first. The kind of practiced neutrality that could bloom into either disappointment or awe. I've seen this competition for 30 years, he said slowly, and I've never seen anyone do what you did. Shoes. The judge offered the envelope. Officially, results will be announced tomorrow, but I wanted to tell you this now, not because of scores, not because of rankings, but because what you did wasn't just a performance, it was something more. He hesitated, then added, more quietly, you reminded me why I started teaching music in the first place. Eli took the envelope in both hands. His fingers brushed the corner, his mother beamed quietly beside him. And as the hallway emptied and the building exhaled the last echoes of the day, Eli whispered the only words he'd spoken to anyone besides his mother that night. Thank you. The judge looked startled and then smiled. Because in that quiet hallway, those two words carried the weight of every note that had come before them. The hotel room was dim, save for a single bedside lamp that hummed softly, casting an amber pool of light across the floral print quilt. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old radiator coils. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, a quiet, watchful presence wrapping the city in hush. Eli lay on the edge of the bed, fully clothed, still in his competition suit. His shoes had been removed, placed neatly beside the bed by his mother, but he hadn't moved since they returned. His fingers twitched now and then, playing ghost notes in the air. He hadn't spoken since the judge handed him the envelope. It still sat unopened on the desk, plain, white, thick, weighted with a question he didn't yet want answered. Across the room, his mother moved gently, quietly. She set a cup of chamomile tea on the bedside table, the steam curling upward like something alive. She didn't push him. didn't ask questions. She knew better. She'd learned to let silence speak when words didn't come. Eli stared at the ceiling. His mind was replaying everything, not just the performance, but the moments before it. The stares, the laughter, the judge's lifted eyebrow when he read Scarbo. The feeling of sitting at the piano, of pushing through pain and fear and fire until there was nothing left but the music itself. He couldn't explain what had happened. It had felt otherworldly, like something moved through him, like his hands belonged to someone older, someone wiser. Someone with shadows in their veins and stars behind their eyes. He hadn't performed the piece. He had relived it. Scarbo hadn't haunted him. He had haunted Scarbo. And now it was over. He sat up slowly, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. His socks whispered against the carpet. The room felt too quiet, too fragile, like one sound could shatter the calm. He stood, crossed the room, picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than it should. The flap was still sealed. His name was written on the front in careful serif script. Contestant 117, Eli Rivers. His mother looked up from where she sat in the armchair by the window. She didn't say anything, just watched, with the softness only a mother could wear. Eli opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick ivory cardstock. At the top, the logo of the National Conservatory Regional Division. Below, in bold print, First Place, Solo Performance Division. And underneath it, in ink that looked freshly penned. For a rendition that defied expectation, transcended technical mastery, and spoke from the raw center of the soul. He stared at the words for a long moment. Then he blinked, and again, and slowly, as though something inside him finally loosened, a breath escaped his chest. Not anxious, not bracing, just a release. His mother crossed the room and stood beside him. She didn't touch him. She knew when contact helped and when it overwhelmed. But her voice was low and even and full of something both strong and breaking. "You did it, Eli." He nodded once, eyes still on the paper. But then he said something he hadn't said since his grandmother died. "I want to play again." His mother inhaled, sharp and quiet. She smiled, though her eyes had already started to shine. "Then we'll find you a piano." The next morning was washed in gray. Soft, overcast light filtered through the windows, and the city outside felt muted, like a held breath. They left the hotel early, trying to avoid the morning rush. But fate had different plans. They'd barely stepped into the lobby when the hotel receptionist looked up from her desk and froze. "You're the boy," she whispered, then turned to someone just behind the counter. "That's him, the pianist." Eli's spine stiffened. His mother offered a wary smile. "Yes, he performed last night." The receptionist blinked and fumbled for her phone. "My sister sent me the video. I didn't believe it. I watched it 3 times this morning." She looked up at Eli, her voice suddenly smaller. "I don't know much about piano, but..." I cried. "I don't even know why." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. By the time they exited the front doors, 3 more people had stopped them. A bellhop, a delivery man with coffee, a guest in running shoes and earbuds dangling from her neck. "You made me feel something," one said. "My daughter's autistic," another offered quietly. "Watching you gave me hope." Eli's head swam. It was too much, too fast, too loud. By the time they reached the sidewalk, his breathing was shallow. The city noise rushed in like a wave. Car horns, barking dogs, the hum of street traffic and far-off construction. His hands flew to the headphones. On. Muffled. Better. His mother took his wrist gently. "You want to go somewhere quiet?" He nodded. They ducked into a nearby cafe. Small, warm, lit with amber sconces and filled with the aroma of cinnamon and espresso. It was early enough that few seats were taken. They found a booth near the back by a dusty, upright piano tucked against the wall like a sleeping animal. Eli stared at it. The wood was chipped. A few of the keys were yellowed. One had a visible crack through the ivory. But it was still beautiful. Still. Alive. The barista brought over 2 hot chocolates with a smile and a nod. "On the house," she said, "for the musician." Eli blinked, unsure how to respond. His fingers curled around the mug as warmth seeped into his skin. And then, slowly, he stood. His mother looked up. "Eli?" He walked toward the piano. The barista froze, halfway through grinding beans. A couple across the room turned. One man reached for his phone, but hesitated. Eli reached out and touched the keys. They were colder than stage keys, stiffer. The action was clunkier, but there was soul in them, something worn and good and true. He sat, his fingers hovered, and then without fanfare he began to play. Not Scarbo this time, not something to prove, something simpler, something pure. Debussy, Clair de Lune. The notes trickled out like candlelight in a dark room, gentle, soft, liquid. It didn't fill the cafe, it blessed it. One note at a time. By the third measure, no one spoke. The espresso machine stopped hissing. A spoon froze in mid-stir. The melody unfolded like memory. His hands moved with ease, not showing off, not conquering, just expressing. The way he wished he could speak, the way he did speak. To the ones who listened, to the ones who heard. As the final note faded into the walls, Eli sat still, hands resting in his lap. He didn't look up, but the stillness in the cafe wasn't awkward. It was sacred. And slowly, as if stirred from a dream, people clapped. Not loud, not rushed. Gentle, reverent, like they'd witnessed something fragile and didn't want to scare it away. His mother wiped a tear. The barista whispered, "Do you give lessons?" Eli smiled, and for the first time in days he laughed. Just once, soft and genuine. Because now he finally understood. It was never about winning. It was about being understood. The video was only 92 seconds long. It didn't show the whole performance, just the final section of Scarbo and the moment Eli bowed. It was shaky, vertical, filmed on a phone from the back row by a student with a trembling hand and no idea what she was about to record. The sound crackled during the crescendos, and the audience gasps were louder than the piano in some parts. But it didn't matter. Because by the end of the second day, the video had over 1.2 million views. By the end of the week, it would pass 25 million. The internet called him the silent prodigy, the boy who burned Scarbo alive, the autistic pianist who made the world stop. Everyone had a theory. Some thought he was a savant. Others assumed it was staged. Some claimed it was AI. But those who understood music, truly understood, didn't ask how he'd done it. They asked why it had moved them so deeply. Eli didn't read the comments. He didn't have social media. He didn't care for the noise. But his mother saw the posts, the articles, the interviews he was invited to. CNN, NPR, the New York Philharmonic. One outlet called him the future of classical music. Another wrote, "His fingers speak louder than 1,000 speeches." Requests flooded in, performance invitations, scholarships, interviews, sponsorships. Strangers sent emails, foundations offered grants. Even a major record label asked if he'd consider recording an album. But Eli wasn't celebrating. Because inside him, something had begun to shift. Not forward, but inward. The morning after the video exploded, he didn't touch the piano. Or the next day. He said little, slept late, ate less. His mother noticed, of course. But she didn't press. She waited, the way someone waits beside a cocoon, not knowing if what emerges will still have wings. By the fifth day, she gently knocked on his door. He sat curled on the floor, knees to chest, facing the window. Outside, early spring sunlight pooled across the windowsill, warming the carpet in soft gold patches. He had the scarf in his hands, folded, refolded, unfolded again. "You haven't played," she said quietly, kneeling beside him. He nodded, but didn't look away from the window. "Are you scared?" He didn't answer. But his hands tensed. "I'm not scared of the piano," he said finally, voice low. "I'm scared of the noise around it." His mother exhaled slowly. She understood. Not the whole of it. No one could, but enough. Enough to know that praise could be just as overwhelming as cruelty, especially when it came all at once. "I used to be invisible," he said. "That was easier." She reached out and brushed his curls back from his forehead. "You were never invisible, Eli. You were just waiting for the world to open its eyes." He closed his. "I don't know if I want to be seen like this. Not like a story. Not like a headline." The scarf slipped from his hands and landed in a soft puddle on the floor. She nodded. "Then we'll find a way to rewrite the story. On your terms." He looked at her now. Really looked. And in his mother's eyes, he saw something rare. Not expectation. Permission. And that made all the difference. That evening, he walked downstairs for the first time in days and sat at the upright piano in the corner of their living room. The keys were familiar. Not perfectly weighted, not concert hall sharp, but warm, soft, like home. He didn't play Ravel. He didn't play Debussy. He played something new, something his. The melody was hesitant at first. Single notes, then slow intervals, a gentle heartbeat pattern with irregular rhythm. It sounded like grief at first, then longing, then memory. His right hand danced while the left walked carefully behind, creating space, safety. His mother stood in the kitchen doorway, tears on her cheeks. It wasn't music anyone knew, but it was him. The next day, she emailed the conservatory and declined the national tour offer. Then the radio interview. Then the scholarship, graciously but firmly. "He's still processing," she wrote. "Thank you for your kindness." A few days later, the head judge from the competition called. He didn't ask for anything, just said he was proud. That people like Eli didn't come around often. That it was okay to rest. Then he said something strange. There was a man in the audience that night, sitting near the exit, wore a dark gray suit. I thought he was a donor, but I checked our guest list later. He wasn't on it. Eli's mother furrowed her brow. "Do you know who he was?" The judge hesitated. "I'm not sure." But when Eli finished playing, the man stood before anyone else did. And he said one thing, very quietly. "That boy doesn't need a teacher. He needs a stage." She thanked him and hung up. That night, Eli dreamed of a stage with no lights, no audience, just him, barefoot in a field of broken pianos that bloomed like wildflowers. He walked from one to the next, pressing keys that sang out memories. Each note released a bird from his chest. He woke up crying and didn't know why. The following week, he received a letter in the mail. Not email, not a call. A real letter, thick parchment, wax seal, the kind of thing that felt like it belonged in another century. The return address was a name he didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet. "We heard your voice, and we believe it belongs not in echoes, but in flight." Beneath the line was an invitation. Not to perform, but to attend. A private retreat. A gathering of neurodiverse musicians, no audience, no cameras, just others like him. Others who heard the world differently. At the bottom, a handwritten note. "Bring the scarf. There's a piano in the forest that's waiting to hear her story again." Eli sat with the letter in his lap for a long time. Then, for the first time in days, he smiled and nodded. He didn't want fame. He wanted connection. Not applause. Understanding. And maybe, just maybe, this place, wherever it was, could be that. Outside, the trees rustled like a soft melody on the wind. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He only needed to play. The car curved along the narrow forest road, its tires humming against gravel as tall trees bowed overhead, their bare branches lacing together in a canopy that flickered with early spring light. The world outside the window was a blur of shifting shadows and budding green. Eli sat in the passenger seat, his fingers resting on his thighs in steady rhythm, tap, 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 like he was counting the breaths between questions. He hadn't asked any yet, but his mother knew one would come. When it did, it would be a real question, and it would matter. In the back seat sat his backpack. Inside it, a rolled-up scarf that still smelled faintly of sandalwood. His grandmother had always worn it in the colder months, loosely wrapped, like she wasn't hiding from the cold, just walking with it. The invitation had been brief, almost cryptic. No website, no sponsors, just a name, a date, and a location. Arden Hall, Hollow Pine Woods. They turned off the main road onto a private lane marked only by a weathered wooden sign, half swallowed by ivy. The trees thickened, the silence deepened. Then, just beyond a final bend, the forest opened. A clearing stretched before them like something out of a dream. At its center stood a building that looked both old and impossibly timeless. Stone and wood, wrapped in vines and softened by moss, its arched windows glowing from within. Arden Hall. They parked near a gravel path. Before Eli could unbuckle, the front door opened. A tall woman with silver-threaded braids stepped out onto the porch. She wore no shoes, only dark linen pants and a shawl that moved like water around her shoulders. Her eyes found Eli instantly, not searching, not judging. Just meeting. "I'm Mara," she said, "and you must be Eli." He hesitated, then nodded once. Her smile came slowly, gently. "We're very glad you came." They followed her through the wooden door into a space that smelled of cedar, dust, and something warm like old books and candle wax. The hallway opened into a grand room lit by glass skylights that poured daylight across floors lined with faded rugs. Instruments stood in quiet pockets around the room, violins on stands, a cello in the corner, a harp tucked beside a wall of windows. And in the center, just beneath a beam of soft sunlight, stood a grand piano. It wasn't gleaming and polished like the ones in competitions. It was older. The wood had darkened with time. The ivory on a few keys had worn smooth. revealing the yellow beneath. But there was something alive about it, something that breathed. Eli stepped closer. He reached out, let his fingers hover above the keys, then lowered one gently. A single note rang out, low and round and warm like the earth humming. "I see you found Ezra," Mara said, stepping beside him. "That piano's been here longer than I have. Everyone who plays it leaves something behind." Eli looked up at her. His eyes asked the question he hadn't spoken yet. "What is this place?" Mara sat in a nearby armchair and gestured for him to sit as well. His mother took a seat by the fireplace, listening but not intruding. "This," Mara said, "is not a school, not a retreat, not even a program. It's a space, a clearing, a moment held open for people like you, people whose music doesn't live in trophies, but in truth." Eli tilted his head. "We don't perform here," she continued. "We don't rank, we witness, and we learn each other's languages." Just then, the door behind them opened. A boy with tousled hair and thick glasses shuffled in, clutching a viola case. He glanced at Eli, then gave a small wave. "That's Jonah," Mara said. "He composes in his sleep, writes full symphonies he doesn't remember by morning. He says they come from the stars." Another door opened. A girl with noise-canceling headphones and glitter-covered fingernails peeked around the corner, then disappeared again with a shy giggle. "She's Ava?" Non-speaking, "but you should hear her play marimba." Eli's eyes widened. His shoulders, for the first time in days, lowered slightly. There were others, and they were like him. After dinner, served on mismatched ceramic plates at a long table where no one was forced to talk, Mara led him down a quiet path through the woods behind the hall. The trees opened onto a second clearing. In the center sat something surreal, an upright piano, its frame sun-bleached and crooked, nestled into a small circle of stones. Vines had begun to grow up one side. A bird's nest peeked from beneath the lid. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. Eli stepped forward. He touched the cracked key with one finger. The note was soft, aged, but still true. "This is where your letter was written," Mara said. "By someone who heard your Scarbo, who believed your grandmother didn't just give you a piece to master, she gave you a path to walk." He looked at her. The forest light danced in his eyes. "Play," she said, "but not for them, not for us, for you." He unrolled the scarf, tied it gently around his wrist, and sat down. No stage, no spotlight, just wind and birds and soil. He closed his eyes, and then he played. Not Scarbo, not Debussy. His. It was raw, uneven. He didn't care, he didn't plan. His fingers found memories, sad ones, strange ones, beautiful ones. Every note was a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. When he finished, no one clapped. But Mara whispered she would have wept, and Eli, quiet, trembling Eli, nodded just once and smiled. That night, as he lay in a hammock strung between two old trees, fireflies blinking lazily above him, he felt something he hadn't felt since before the competition. Peace. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was becoming, not a prodigy, not a headline, not a symbol, just Eli. And that was more than enough. The morning mist curled low between the trees, draping the forest floor in silver threads. Birds called softly from the canopy as the sun filtered through pine needles and flickered over damp leaves. In the distance, a brook whispered its secrets to the rocks. Eli stood barefoot on the porch of Arden Hall, mug of tea in hand, the steam curling up against his face like breath from another world. His headphones hung around his neck. He didn't need them here. Not in this place where silence wasn't empty but sacred, where no one shouted to be heard. Behind him, the old wooden floor creaked as someone approached. It was Jonah, the viola boy from the day before. He wore 2 different socks and had dark crescents under his eyes, like someone who stayed up thinking about galaxies. He didn't say anything, just sat cross-legged beside Eli and pulled a folded piece of paper from his hoodie pocket. He offered it like a leaf. Eli hesitated, then took it. Unfolded, it was a hand-drawn staff with an unfinished melody written in soft pencil strokes. The notes were delicate, hesitant, like someone trying to write down a memory before it faded. But they had a pulse, a pattern. They asked a question. Eli didn't speak. He took the mug of tea, placed it beside the bench, then stood and disappeared inside. Jonah waited. 3 minutes later, Eli returned, with a small notebook, a mechanical pencil, and a quiet determination in his walk. He sat, listened, then began to write beneath Jonah's bars, answering them. A musical conversation. One boy composing dreams, the other responding in instinct, shape, breath, no words exchanged, but volumes spoken. That afternoon they played it together in the main room. Jonah on his viola, Eli at Ezra the grand piano. The melody wasn't perfect, the rhythm faltered in places, but it breathed, it lived. Ava sat cross-legged nearby, eyes closed, swaying like seagrass in shallow water. Her marimba mallets tapped the rug unconsciously. When the final note faded, no one clapped. They just exhaled. The piece didn't need applause. It needed remembrance. Afterward, Jonah handed Eli a single red guitar pick. "I collect these," he said finally, in the low gravel of someone unused to using his voice. "I only give them to people who hear more than sound." Eli nodded and tucked it beside the scarf in his pocket. The next few days passed in rhythms all their own. Meals arrived without fanfare. People came and went in silence. Some sang without words, others played with their eyes closed, some didn't speak at all. It didn't matter. Here, music was not performance, it was presence. On the fifth evening, as the sun slipped low and the trees glowed amber, Mara approached Eli while he sat alone by the forest piano. "Someone is arriving tonight," she said. "He asked for you by name." Eli's brow furrowed. "He said he was there that night," she added softly, "at the competition." Eli froze. "He's not press, not a recruiter, just someone who heard what you were really saying." The fireflies rose again that night. Eli waited by the path near the edge of the woods. He didn't know why, but his pulse was faster than usual. He kept tapping the red pick between his fingers, back and forth, click, click, click. Then, a flashlight beam cut through the dark. The man stepped into the clearing like a ghost made flesh. Tall, early 60s, weathered face, simple clothes, no camera, no clipboard. But something in his eyes made Eli tense, not from fear but recognition. The man didn't speak right away. He looked around, took in the trees, the piano, the boy, then said simply, "I knew your grandmother." Eli's breath caught. "She played for me once, long ago, when I was a young pianist trying to find something real in a world that only paid attention to noise." He stepped closer. "She said something I've never forgotten." Eli stared at him, waiting. The man knelt in the dirt beside the piano, brushed his hand across the keys like he was waking an old friend. She said, "The best music doesn't come from the hands, it comes from the wounds." Eli swallowed. The man looked up, voice softer now. "And I saw your wounds in that performance, Eli, not because you exposed them, but because you transformed them." They sat there in stillness, dusk folding around them like a cloak. Then the man pulled something from his coat, a recording, a vinyl, not a flash drive, not a link, an actual record. "She made this just before she passed," he said. "She asked me to keep it until I met someone who reminded me of her." He placed it gently in Eli's lap and stood. "I think you know what to do." He walked back into the forest and was gone. No name, no card, just an echo. That night, Eli sat by the fire in the main hall. The record played on an old turntable Mara kept hidden behind a tapestry. The room was quiet as a prayer. The voice of his grandmother filled the space, not singing, not speaking, playing, a piece Eli had never heard before. Riled, haunting, and halfway through, it shifted. A phrase Eli did recognize, a motif from Scarbo, reimagined. Not as fear, but as grace. He pressed the scarf to his lips and wept. Not because he was sad, but because he'd finally heard what she'd been trying to say all along. The fire had gone out hours ago, leaving behind a soft cradle of ash that glowed faintly on the hearth. Arden Hall was still. The kind of stillness that made time feel less like a line and more like a breath held by the world. Eli sat cross-legged on the rug, the record player's turntable now silent, its needle resting in the groove's end. Everyone else had long since gone to their rooms, but he stayed, unmoving, letting the last echoes of his grandmother's music circle through him like the rings inside a tree trunk, invisible, but there. He could still hear that melody. A piece of Scarbo, yes, but transfigured, softened, almost forgiven. The motif she once challenged him to play was no longer a dare. It had become a benediction. And in it, she had spoken to him in the only language they ever truly shared. Not English, not even touch, but music. It wasn't until the stars had shifted their place in the sky that he finally moved. He rose in silence, retrieved his scarf from the back of the chair, and wrapped it loosely around his shoulders. Then he walked outside, barefoot, through the moonlit woods with no flashlight and no fear, guided only by the deep pull in his chest that told him where to go. The forest piano waited. Nestled in its circle of stones, half swallowed by moss and vine, it looked like a secret whispered from the earth. But Eli no longer saw it as an old relic. Tonight, it felt like a gate, a doorway. He sat before it, fingers hovering, closed his eyes, and began. It started with a single note, low, resonant, ancient. Then another, dissonant, brushing up against the first like friction turned into sound. It wasn't a piece he had practiced. It wasn't even one he remembered learning. It was being born, in real time. The melody came slowly, rising like a breath drawn through grief. Then came rhythm, his left hand marking time, not with certainty, but vulnerability. Like someone walking across a frozen lake, each step deliberate, every crack beneath the ice singing back. Then came fire. His right hand surged forward into a cascade of minor chords, haunted by Scarbo's ghost. But this time, it wasn't fear driving it. It was understanding. The goblin from Ravel's score had returned, but it no longer danced to mock him. Now it danced with him. His fingers blurred, not with speed but with feeling, notes layered atop each other like leaves pressed into the pages of a journal no one else would ever read. He cried while he played, but didn't stop. Couldn't, because this was his way of saying everything he'd carried for years. The fear, the ridicule, the silence. The scream trapped inside him that only the piano could translate. The scarf fluttered from his shoulder and landed across the keys. He let it lie there, didn't move it. Instead, he played around it, let its presence shape the sound. He thought of his grandmother then, not as she was in the hospital, thin and quiet, but as she had been in his memory's golden hour. Laughing, playing, whispering stories of composers who wrote symphonies in candlelight and rage. "You have your own symphony, Eli," she had said once. "Don't let the world convince you it has to sound like theirs." He reached the final phrase, paused, then played it slow, 4 notes, a rest, then one final chord, soft, broken, and beautiful. It rang into the trees and stayed there. He didn't bow, didn't need to. No one clapped, no one spoke, but the forest heard, and that was enough. He remained there long after the last note faded, breathing in the scent of pine and old wood and something else, something sacred. It wasn't pride he felt, or even relief. It was return. To himself, to the boy who had once thought silence was a prison, and now knew it could be a home. By the time he rose, the sky was shifting into dawn. The birds had begun their slow call. The light was faint, brushed in silver. He turned, and saw Mara standing in the shadows of the trees. She didn't speak, just watched him with the expression of someone witnessing something too rare for words. He walked past her gently, and as he passed, she reached out and pressed a small folded paper into his hand. "From the man who came," she said softly. "He left before sunrise, but he asked me to give you this." Eli opened it as he walked. It was not a letter. It was a page of sheet music. 3 staves, no title, no tempo markings, just 5 measures. In the margin, a note written in the kind of handwriting that leaned left, like it had run from storms and survived. "Heard your voice, borrowed your fire. This is what I made with it. Add your own." Eli stared at the page. The melody was strange, unfinished. It begged for more. He folded it, tucked it inside his pocket, next to the scarf, next to Jonah's red pick, and smiled. That afternoon he didn't go to the piano. He went to Ava. She was sitting beneath the willow tree with her marimba, tapping out clusters of notes that sounded like wind chimes caught in a dream. He held out the page. She looked at it, then at him, and nodded. Later, they would play it together, and it would become something new. Not his, not hers, but theirs. The beginning of something no audience would ever fully understand, but some would feel, and that would be enough. The letter arrived in a pale blue envelope, its corner slightly bent from the post. It bore no seal, no logo, only Eli's name written in clean, blocky print. The return address was from New York. Not a magazine, not a label, just a school. His mother opened it first, sitting beside him on the back steps of their home. The spring air had returned with soft certainty. Warm sun on bare arms, bees in the lavender, the smell of damp soil rising like memory. She handed him the envelope wordlessly. He held it like he held everything, with both hands and a breath held tight inside his chest. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single letter, and a flyer folded around it. He didn't read the letter first. He opened the flyer. It was hand-designed, not slick, not corporate, a blend of watercolor and ink that looked like it had been made with trembling care. Across the top, the first annual Resonance Festival, a celebration of neurodiverse sound. And below that in smaller writing, featuring Eli Rivers, Jonah Reyes, Ava Tran, and others. He stared at the words for a long time, not because his name was at the top, but because it wasn't alone. His mother gently touched his wrist. "You don't have to say yes." He didn't respond. But that night, he sat at the old upright piano in the corner of their living room, the one with the worn middle C and the missing pedal cover, and played a piece he hadn't touched in weeks, Scarbo. Not the full thing, just the opening bars, but slower now, like something once feared that had become a friend. And in that moment, he understood. He was ready. The festival was held inside an old concert hall nestled between two brownstone libraries in the East Village. It wasn't huge, maybe 500 seats, max, but it felt different from the conservatory halls he remembered. The air wasn't thick with judgment or expectation. It buzzed with something softer. Curiosity. The posters were hand-drawn, the programs printed on recycled paper. Volunteers wore pins that read, "We don't need eye contact to connect." The performers gathered backstage like constellations, each bright in their own corner of the sky. Jonah had a new composition tucked under his arm, his fingers ink-stained and jittery. Ava sat beside a new marimba, its wood freshly polished, her headphones neon pink this time, decorated with glittery music notes. Others tuned guitars, tapped drums, adjusted synths. One girl signed her entire warm-up with her hands while nodding to her rhythm partner, who responded with a low cello hum. Eli stood among them, the scarf looped once around his neck, not as armor, as memory. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They already knew who he was. And they were ready. The first half of the concert passed like a dream, short pieces, some chaotic, some heartbreakingly still. There were duets between instruments that had never spoken to each other before. There was a boy who composed in real time using loops made from the sound of a heartbeat. A trio played a storm on stage with only wind chimes, cello, and breath. No one clapped between pieces. They let the silence hold. Then came Eli. He walked to the piano as the lights dimmed, not into darkness but into a soft blue glow, like twilight wrapped around the keys. He sat, waited, then turned his head slightly and nodded. A door opened. Ava stepped out, carrying a small hand drum. Jonah followed with his viola, the bow already in place. A hush fell across the audience. Eli placed his fingers on the keys and began. It was the same piece from the woods, the one they had stitched together from memory and hope and unfinished ideas. But it had grown. There were new notes now, echoes from each of them. Ava's rhythm was gentle, grounded, like footsteps on familiar earth. Jonah's viola wept and then soared, tracing emotion like light does water. And Eli wove it all together like thread pulled from his heart. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They weren't trying to be anything. They were simply speaking, together. The final chord was not loud. It didn't thunder. It settled, like breath returning to a chest that had held too much for too long. Silence followed, then slowly, a single clap, then two, then a wave of hands, clapping, yes, but some also signing, some swaying, some placing hands on hearts, some crying. Not everyone understood what they'd just heard, but everyone felt it, and that was enough. Backstage, after the final piece of the night, Eli sat beside Jonah and Ava, their shoulders touching lightly. A producer came up, smiling. "You three could tour," she said. "The world would show up to listen." Ava tilted her head and gave a thumbs up. Jonah just grinned and said, "We're not chasing the world." Then he looked at Eli. "We're building our own." Eli didn't speak. He reached into his pocket and took out the old page, the one left by the man in the forest, with only 5 measures written. He unfolded it, stared at it, then added one more note. In his own hand, small, precise, hopeful, and smiled. The piano in the church hadn't been tuned in years. It sat crooked against the far wall, half swallowed by cobwebs and the heavy scent of dust and candle wax. Light streamed in through the stained glass windows, painting shifting shapes across the faded keys. A was sharp, E-flat stuck sometimes. The middle pedal didn't do anything at all. Eli loved it instantly. He ran his fingers along the side of the instrument, feeling the grooves worn smooth by other hands, unknown players, forgotten hymns, long-ago lullabies. There was history here. Not in plaques or programs. In silence. This place wasn't a concert hall. It was a community center. a crumbling one, underfunded, understaffed. Most days it smelled of old carpet and lentil soup, but it had become something precious to the people who walked through its doors. And now, it was Eli's favorite room in the world. He didn't arrive with cameras. He didn't announce his visits. He just came. Sometimes he taught small classes, 3 or 4 kids at a time. One of them, Malik, liked to press the sustain pedal and pretend he was summoning storms. Another, Liana, could only play with one hand, but created melodies so sweet they made grown men cry. One girl, Sophia, had never spoken a word, but after the 3rd week, she sat beside Eli, rested her head on the piano, and hummed in perfect pitch. He never corrected them. He never forced formality. He gave them the one thing he'd needed most when he was their age, a safe place to sound like themselves. It wasn't about teaching music. It was about letting music teach them. The room became their sanctuary. Once a week, they left the door open so neighbors could come in and listen, not as an audience, but as witnesses. People brought folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, sometimes their grief. And in return, the children played what they could. Not perfect, not polished, but real. One afternoon, a boy no older than 7 banged on the door with his father trailing behind, both out of breath. The boy clutched a battered toy keyboard with missing keys. The father looked apologetic. "He saw your video," the man said. "The Scarbo one. He watches it every day. We don't have a piano, but he won't stop trying." Eli stepped forward, knelt in front of the boy, and simply said, "Do you want to try a real one?" The boy nodded, eyes wide. That day they played a duet, Eli on the left hand, the boy on the right. It was clumsy, joyful, wild. People wept, not because of the skill, but because of the courage. Outside the church, the city rolled on. No headlines, no interviews, just a small world quietly shifting note by note. One evening, long after the children had gone, Eli remained behind, alone. The lights were off. Only the window's golden sunset lit the room. He sat at the piano, touched the keys, and remembered. He remembered the auditorium, the laughter, the judge's doubt, his own shaking hands. He remembered the forest, the scarf, the man with no name, the vinyl. He remembered his grandmother's voice the way people remember lullabies, not the words, the feeling. He began to play, softly, not Scarbo, not Debussy, not even the song from the woods, something else, something quieter. It was made of pauses, of intervals stitched between breaths. A melody born not from ambition, but arrival. The room held him gently. The walls did not echo. They embraced. He stopped mid-phrase, not because he forgot what came next, but because he knew it didn't matter. He let the silence stretch long and warm, then smiled. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the old page of music, the one the stranger had given him in the forest. It was creased and stained now, but still legible. The 5 measures remained, so did his addition. He reached for a pencil and added one final note, then folded it again and placed it beneath the piano lid, a gift for whoever came next. He stood and walked out into the evening air, the sun melting down behind the rooftops like honey poured from heaven. He didn't need a stage. He didn't need a title. He didn't need to be anyone's story, because he had finally become his own. And the music, as always, would carry on, even in silence, especially in silence. Not every genius shouts. Some speak through silence, some through trembling hands, and some, like Eli, through music that holds all the pain and power this world can't quite name. This is not the story of a boy who won a competition. It's the story of a young soul who turned cruelty into courage, mockery into melody, and loneliness into a language the world couldn't ignore. Eli didn't need to outplay anyone to prove his worth. He needed to be heard, on his own terms. And when he finally sat at the piano and poured his heart into Scarbo, the piece that once symbolized chaos and fear, he did something few people ever do in their lifetime. He transformed his scars into symphonies. He reminded us that labels do not define potential, that the quietest person in the room might carry the loudest truth, that neurodivergence is not a limitation, it's a different way of seeing, of feeling, of creating. And when embraced, it can change everything. The world wanted to make Eli a headline. He chose to become a home for others who'd been ignored, silenced, underestimated. And in doing so, he gave every child, every artist, every person who's ever been told they don't belong the permission to rewrite their story. You don't have to be understood by everyone. You just have to stay true to the music inside you. So if you've ever felt different, if you've ever been laughed at, dismissed, excluded for who you are or how you express yourself, let Eli remind you, your voice matters, your gift matters, and even if no one is clapping, keep playing, because the right people, the ones who feel, they're listening, and one day when you least expect it, the world will finally hear your song.